Hello there. Welcome back to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. Each episode we'll read about 30 minutes of a history book. We are reading chapter 20 of A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. Chapter 20 is called The 70s Under Control with a question mark. If you like what you hear, please hit that like and subscribe button. And hit the notification bell because YouTube has been known to unsubscribe people. Let's dig in, shall we? In the early 70s, the system seemed out of control. It could not hold the loyalty of the public. As early as 1970, according to the University of Michigan's Survey Research Center, trust in government was low in every section of the population, and there was a significant difference by class. Of professional people, 40% had low political trust in the government. Of unskilled blue-collar workers, 66% had low trust. Public opinion surveys in 1971, after 7 years of intervention in Vietnam, showed an unwillingness to come to the aid of other countries, assuming they were attacked by communist-backed forces. Even for countries allied to the United States in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or Mexico, right on our southern border, there was no majority opinion for intervening with American troops. As for Thailand, if it were under communist attack, only 12% of whites interrogated would send troops. 4% of non-whites would do so. Wonder why he uses the word interrogated right there. In the summer of 1972, anti-war people in the Boston area were picketing Honeywell Corporation. The literature they distributed pointed out that Honeywell was producing anti-personnel weapons used in Vietnam, like the deadly cluster bomb that had riddled thousands of Vietnamese civilians with painful, hard-to-extricate pellets. Almost 600 ballots were given to the Honeywell employees, asking if they thought that Honeywell should discontinue making these weapons. Of the 231 persons who returned the ballots, 131 said Honeywell should stop. 88 said it should not. And apparently about 12 people didn't respond. They were invited to make comments. A typical no comment: Honeywell is not responsible for what the Department of Defense does with the goods it buys. A typical yes comment: how may we have pride in our work when the entire basis of this work is immoral? The Survey Research Center of the University of Michigan had been posing the question, is the government run by a few big interests looking out for themselves? You think? The answer in 1964 had been yes from 26% of those polled. By 1972, the answer was yes from 53% of those polled. I bet if they did that poll right now, we'd have like 70%. An article in the American Political Science Review by Arthur H. Miller, reporting on the extensive polling done by the Survey Research Center, said that the polls showed widespread basic discontent and political alienation. He added, political scientists often took on the worries of the establishment. What is startling and somewhat alarming is the rapid degree of change in this basic attitude over a period of only 6 years. More voters than ever refused to identify themselves as either Democrats or Republicans. Back in 1940, 20% of those polled called themselves independents. In 1974, 34% called themselves independents. And just for reference, I can tell you that right now it's about 45%, somewhere around there. So it didn't really go up that much in the last, 45 years. The courts, the juries, and even judges were not behaving as usual. Juries were acquitting radicals. Angela Davis, an acknowledged communist, was acquitted by an all-white jury on the West Coast. Black Panthers, whom the government had tried in every way to malign and destroy were freed by juries in several trials. A judge in western Massachusetts threw out a case against a young activist, Sam Lovejoy, who had toppled a 500-foot tower erected by a utility company trying to set up a nuclear power plant. In Washington, D.C., in August 1973, a Superior Court judge refused to sentence 6 men charged with unlawful entry who had stepped from a White House tour line to protest the bombing of Cambodia. Undoubtedly, much of this national mood of hostility to government and business came out of the Vietnam War. Its 55,000 casualties, its moral shame, its exposure of government lies and atrocities. On top of this came the political disgrace of the Nixon administration in the scandals that came to be known by the one-word label, you guessed it, Watergate, and which led to the historic resignation from the presidency, the first in American history, of Richard Nixon in August 1974. It began during the presidential campaign in June of 1972, when 5 burglars carrying wiretapping and photo equipment were caught in the act of breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate apartment complex of Washington, D.C. One of the 5, James McCord Jr., worked for the Nixon campaign. He was security officer for the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP. Another of the 5 had an address book in which was listed the name of E. Howard Hunt, and Hunt's address was listed as the White House. He was assistant to Charles Colson, who was special counsel to President Nixon. Both McCord and Hunt had worked for many years for the CIA. Hunt had been the CIA man in charge of the invasion of Cuba in 1961, and 3 of the Watergate burglars were veterans of the invasion. McCord, as CREEP's security man, worked for the chief of CREEP, John Mitchell, the Attorney General of the United States. Every time I read this stuff or hear this stuff, I always wonder, why would you name your committee to re-elect CREEP? That's just a weird... Why would you name it that? Come up with something different. All right, whatever. Thus, due to an unforeseen arrest by police unaware of the high-level connections of the burglars, information was out to the public before anyone could stop it, linking the burglars to important officials in the Nixon campaign committee, to the CIA, and to Nixon's Attorney General. Mitchell denied any connection with the burglary, and Nixon, in a press conference 5 days after the event, said, "The White House has had no involvement whatever in this particular incident." What followed the next year after a grand jury in September indicted the Watergate burglars, plus Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy, was that one after another, lesser officials of the Nixon administration, fearing prosecution, began to talk. They gave information in judicial proceedings, to a Senate investigating committee, to the press. They implicated not only John Mitchell, but Robert Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, Nixon's highest White House aides, and finally Richard Nixon himself, in not only the Watergate burglaries, but a whole series of illegal actions against political opponents and anti-war activists. Nixon and his aides lied again and again as they tried to cover up their involvement. These facts came out in the various testimonies. Number 1. Attorney General John Mitchell controlled a secret fund of $350,000 to $700,000 to be used against the Democratic Party for forging letters, leaking false news items to the press, stealing campaign files. Number 2. Gulf Oil Corporation, ITT, International Telephone and Telegraph, American Airlines, and other huge American corporations had made illegal contributions running into millions of dollars to the Nixon campaign. In September of 1971, shortly after the New York Times printed Daniel Ellsberg's copies of the top-secret Pentagon Papers, the administration planned and carried out, Howard Hunt and G. Gordon Liddy themselves doing it, the burglary of the office of Ellsberg's psychiatrist, looking for Ellsberg's records. 4. After the Watergate burglars were caught, Nixon secretly pledged to give them executive clemency if they were imprisoned, and suggested that up to $1 million be given them to keep them quiet. In fact, $450,000 was given to them on Ehrlichman's orders. Number 5, Nixon's nominee for head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover had recently died, L. Patrick Gray, revealed that he had turned over the FBI records on its investigation of the Watergate burglary to Nixon's legal assistant John Dean, and that Attorney General Richard Kleindienst, Mitchell had just resigned, saying he wanted to pursue his private life, Kleindienst had ordered him not to discuss Watergate with the Senate Judiciary Committee. Number 6, 2 former members of Nixon's cabinet, John Mitchell and Maurice Stans, were charged with taking $250,000 from a financier named Robert Vesco in return for their help with the Securities and Exchange Commission investigation of Vesco's activities. Number 7, it turned out that certain material had disappeared from FBI files. Material from a series of illegal wiretaps ordered by Henry Kissinger, placed on the telephones of 4 journalists and 13 government officials, and was in the White House safe of Nixon's advisor John Ehrlichman. Number 8, one of the Watergate burglars, Bernard Barker, told the Senate committee that he had also been involved in a plan to physically attack Daniel Ellsberg while Ellsberg spoke at an anti-war rally in Washington. Number 9, a deputy director of the CIA testified that Haldeman and Ehrlichman told him it was Nixon's wish that the CIA tell the FBI not to pursue its investigation beyond the Watergate burglary. Number 10, I'm sorry it's almost done. I know this is a little bit long. Number 10, almost by accident, a witness told the Senate committee that President Nixon had tapes of all personal conversations and phone conversations at the White House. Nixon at first refused to turn over the tapes, and when he finally did, they had been tampered with. 18.5 minutes of one tape had been erased. And the wording is funny, but I think that that's not the only tape that was tampered with. Number 11. In the midst of all this, Nixon's vice president, Spiro Agnew, was indicted in Maryland for receiving bribes from Maryland contractors in return for political favors, and resigned from the vice presidency in October 1973. Nixon appointed Congressman Gerald Ford to take Agnew's place. Nowadays, taking money for political favors is legal, huh? There was a time, huh? Number 12, over $10 million in government money had been used by Nixon on his private homes in San Clemente and Key Biscayne on grounds of security, and he had illegally taken, with the aid of a bit of forgery, a $576,000 tax deduction from some of his papers. Number 13, and this is the last one. It was disclosed that for over a year in 1969 to 70, the U.S. had engaged in a secret, massive bombing of Cambodia, which it kept from the American public and even from Congress. It was a swift and sudden fall. In the November 1972 presidential elections, Nixon and Agnew had won 60% of the popular vote and carried every state except Massachusetts, defeating an anti-war candidate, Senator George McGovern. By June of 1973, a Gallup poll showed 67% of those polled thought Nixon was involved in the Watergate break-in or lied to cover up. By the fall of 1973, 8 different resolutions had been introduced in the House of Representatives for the impeachment of President Nixon. The following year, a House committee drew up a bill of impeachment to present it to a full House. Nixon's advisors told him it would pass the House by the required majority, and then the Senate would vote the necessary two-thirds majority to remove him from office. On August 8, 1974, Nixon resigned. 6 months before Nixon resigned, the business magazine Dunn's Review reported a poll of 300 corporation executives. Almost all had voted for Nixon in 1972, but now a majority said he should resign. Right now, 90% of Wall Street would cheer if Nixon resigns, said the vice president of Merrill Lynch Government Securities. When he did, there was a relief in all the sectors of the establishment. Gerald Ford, taking Nixon's office, said, "Our long national nightmare is over." Newspapers, whether they had been for or against Nixon, liberal or conservative, celebrated the successful, peaceful culmination of the Watergate crisis. "The system is working," said a long-time strong critic of the Vietnam War, New York Times columnist Anthony Lewis. The 2 journalists who had much to do with investigating and exposing Nixon, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward of the Washington Post, wrote that with Nixon's departure, there might be restoration. All of this was in a mood of relief, of gratitude. No respectable American newspaper said what was said by Claude Julien, editor of Le Monde Diplomatique, in September 1974. And I won't try the French accent because I want to make sure that you understand what I'm saying. "The elimination of Mr. Richard Nixon leaves intact all the mechanisms and all the false values which permitted the Watergate scandal." Julien noted that Nixon's Secretary of State Henry Kissinger would remain at his post. In other words, that Nixon's foreign policy would continue. That is to say, Julien wrote, that Washington will continue to support General Pinochet in Chile, General Geisel in Brazil, General Stroessner in Paraguay, etc. Months after Julien wrote this, it was disclosed that top Democratic and Republican leaders in the House of Representatives had given secret assurance to Nixon that if he resigned, they would not support criminal proceedings against him. One of them, the ranking Republican of the Judiciary Committee, said, "We had all been shuddering about what 2 weeks of televised floor debates on impeachment would do, how it would tear the country apart and affect foreign policy." The New York Times articles that reported on Wall Street's hope for Nixon's resignation quoted one Wall Street financier as saying that if Nixon resigned, what we will have is the same play with different players. When Gerald Ford, a conservative Republican who had supported all of Nixon's policies, was nominated for president, a liberal senator from California, Alan Cranston, spoke for him on the floor, saying he had polled many people, Republicans and Democrats, and found an almost startling consensus of conciliation that is developing around him. When Nixon resigned and Ford became president, the New York Times said, "Out of the despair of Watergate has come an inspiring new demonstration of the uniqueness and strength of the American democracy." A few days later, the Times wrote happily that the peaceful transfer of power brought a cleansing sense of relief to the American people. In the charges brought by the House Committee on Impeachment against Nixon, it seemed clear that the committee did not want to emphasize those elements in his behavior which were found in other presidents and which might be repeated in the future. It stayed clear of Nixon's dealings with powerful corporations. It did not mention the bombing of Cambodia. It concentrated on things peculiar to Nixon, not on fundamental policies continuous among American presidents at home or abroad. The word was out. Get rid of Nixon, but keep the system. Theodore Sorensen, who had been an advisor to President Kennedy, wrote at the time of Watergate, the underlying causes of the gross misconduct in our law enforcement system now being revealed are largely personal, not institutional. Some structural changes are needed. All the rotten apples should be thrown out, but save the barrel. My throat is very dry, I'm sorry. Indeed, the barrel was saved. Nixon's foreign policy remained. The government's connection to corporate interests remained. Ford's closest friends in Washington were corporate lobbyists. Surprise, surprise. Alexander Haig, who had been one of Nixon's closest advisors, who had helped in processing the tapes before turning them over to the public, and who gave the public misinformation about the tapes, was appointed by President Ford to be the head of the armed forces of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. One of Ford's first acts was to pardon Nixon, thus saving him from possible criminal proceedings and allowing him to retire with a huge pension in California. The establishment had cleansed itself of members of the club who had broken the rules, drained the swamp, so to speak. But it took some pains not to treat them too harshly. Those few who received jail sentences got short terms, were sent to the most easygoing federal institutions available, and were given special privileges not given to ordinary prisoners. Richard Kleindienst pleaded guilty. He got a $100 fine and a month in jail, which was suspended. That Nixon would go, but that the power of the president to do anything he wanted in the name of national security would stay in a big way. This was underscored by a Supreme Court decision in 1974. The court said Nixon had to turn over his White House tapes to the special Watergate prosecutor, but at the same time it affirmed the confidentiality of presidential communications, which it could not uphold in Nixon's case, but which remained as a general principle when the president made a claim of need to protect military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security secrets. The televised Senate committee hearings on Watergate stopped suddenly before the subject of corporate connections was reached. It was typical of the selective coverage of important events by the television industry. Bizarre shenanigans like the Watergate burglary were given full treatment, while instances of ongoing practice, the My Lai massacre, the secret bombing of Cambodia, the work of the FBI and the CIA, were given the most fleeting attention. Dirty tricks against the Socialist Workers' Party, the Black Panthers, other radical groups, had to be searched for in a few newspapers. The whole nation heard the details of the quick break-in at the Watergate apartment. There was never a similar television hearing on the long-term break-in in Vietnam. In the trial of John Mitchell and Maurice Stans for obstruction of justice in impeding a Securities and Exchange Commission investigation of Robert Vesco, a contributor to Nixon, George Bradford Cook, former general counsel of the SEC, testified that on November 13, 1972, he crouched in a Texas rice field while on a goose hunt with Maurice Stans and told him he wanted to be chairman of the SEC. For this, he would cut out a critical paragraph in the SEC charges against Vesco that referred to Vesco's $200,000 secret contribution to the Nixon campaign. Corporate influence on the White House is a permanent fact of the American system. Most of it is wise enough to stay within the law. Under Nixon, they took chances. An executive in the meatpacking industry said during the Watergate events that he had been approached by a Nixon campaign official and told that while a $25,000 contribution would be appreciated, for $50,000 you get to talk to the president. Some things never change, huh? Many of these corporations gave money to both sides so that whichever one they would have friends in the administration. Chrysler Corporation urged its executives to support the party and candidate of their choice. Oh. Chrysler Corporation urged its executives to support the party and candidate of their choice, and then collected the checks from them and delivered the checks to Republican or Democratic campaign committees. International Telephone and Telegraph was an old hand at giving money on both sides. In 1960, it had made illegal contributions to Bobby Baker, who worked with Democratic senators, including Lyndon Johnson. A senior vice president of ITT was quoted by one of his assistants as saying, "The board of directors have it set up to butter both sides, so we'll be in good position whoever wins." And in 1970, an ITT director, John McCone, who also had been head of the CIA, told Henry Kissinger, Secretary of State, and Richard Helms, CIA director, that ITT was willing to give $1 million to help the U.S. government in its plans to overthrow the Allende government in Chile, which was a popularly elected government. In 1971, ITT planned to take over the $1.5 billion Hartford Fire Insurance Company, the largest merger in corporate history. The Antitrust Division of the Justice Department moved to prosecute ITT for violating the antitrust laws. However, the prosecution did not take place and ITT was allowed to merge with Hartford. It was all settled out of court in a secret arrangement in which ITT agreed to donate $400,000 to the Republican Party. It seemed that Richard Kleindienst, Deputy Attorney General, had 6 meetings with an ITT director named Felix Rohatyn, and then brought in the head of the Antitrust Division, Richard McLaren, who was persuaded by Rohatyn that to stop the merger would cause a hardship for ITT stockholders. McLaren agreed. He was later appointed a federal judge. One of the items not mentioned in the impeachment charges and never televised in the Senate hearings was the way the government cooperated with the milk industry. You heard me, the milk industry. In early 1971, the Secretary of Agriculture announced that the government would not increase its price supports for milk, the regular subsidy to the big milk producers. Then the Associated Milk Producers began giving money to the Nixon campaign, met in the White House with Nixon, and the Secretary of Agriculture gave more money. And the Secretary announced that new analysis made it necessary to raise milk price supports from $4.66 to $4.93 a hundredweight. More contributions were made, and the total exceeded $400,000. The price increases added $500 million to the profits of dairy farmers, mostly big corporations, of course, at the expense of consumers. Whether Nixon or Ford or any Republican or Democrat was president, the system would work pretty much the same. A Senate subcommittee investigating multinational corporations revealed a document, given passing mention in a few newspapers, in which oil company economists discussed holding back production of oil to keep prices up. Aramco, the Arabian American Oil Corporation, 75% of whose stock was held by American oil companies and 25% by Saudi Arabia, had made $1 profit on a barrel of oil in 1973. In 1974, it was making $4.50 on a barrel. None of this would be affected by who was president. Even in the most diligent of investigations in the Watergate affair, that of Archibald Cox, a special prosecutor later fired by Nixon. The corporations got off easy. American Airlines, which admitted making illegal contributions to the Nixon campaign, was fined $5,000. Goodyear was fined $5,000. The 3M Corporation, which makes Scotch tape, was fined $3,000. A Goodyear official was fined $1,000. A 3M official was fined $500. The New York Times, October 20th, 1973, reported, Mr. Cox charged them with only the misdemeanor of making illegal contributions. The misdemeanor under the law involved non-willful contributions. The felony count involving willful contributions is punishable by a fine of $10,000 and or a 2-year jail term. The misdemeanor by a $1,000 fine and or a 1-year jail term. Asked at the courthouse here how the 2 executives who had admitted making the payments could be charged with making non-willing contributions, Mr. McBride, Cox's staff, replied, "That's a legal question which frankly baffles me as well." And I think maybe we should call that a wrap. We'll pick it up next time. Thanks for joining me. If you liked listening to me read, please hit that like and subscribe button, the notification bell, so that you will be notified when each time I make a new video. Check out my previous videos, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for joining me.